Good morning. Balcony, good morning to you guys too. You guys can say good morning back. It's okay. Choir, morning. So let's be honest with one another for a second, because I was in here last week for Easter, and I'm looking around the sanctuary now, and we're an honest folk, you and I, and so I think we need to name the elephant in the room. The preacher is not wearing shoes. And I'm just going to be real honest with you. This is going to be the only Sunday, perhaps, in this sanctuary where you are invited to worship and take off your shoes. You can keep them on if you'd like. That's totally appropriate. But I feel like it's only fair that I should explain myself if I'm going to take off my shoes. You see, when Moses met the Lord at the burning bush, the first thing that God said to Moses was, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground." And so this morning, this space is holy ground. This sanctuary is holy ground, for God's presence is here flowing among us. And so I take off my shoes when I preach here in the Justin building or wherever I am when I lead worship, because it reminds me that God's presence is moving among us, that this sanctuary is holy ground. As a disclaimer, though, I did just get back this morning from a camping trip with some middle and high school boys and did quite a lot of hiking. So I did take a shower this morning, really scrubbed my feet, but I think, again, we should all be on the same page. It seems fair to one another. So here we are, it's the Sunday after Easter, and last week we had the instruments and the music and the flowers and the packed house, which leaves us asking every year, so what do we do now? And this question should probably be all the more obvious to you because they've clearly brought the C team in to preach. And that's being really generous, because I think I'm more like the Q or the R or the S or T team, but no school lets that happen, because at some point you have to have mercy on the people who just can't cut it. So I promise sophistication in class will be back here at this pulpit next week, but this week you're just stuck with me, wondering what do we do now that Easter has passed, now that we've celebrated resurrection last week. So I don't know what it's like in your houses, but on Christmas morning in the Leathers house, there are a couple of things that happen. Now, my younger brother Thomas and I have gotten a little bit older, and so we don't wake up at 5 o'clock like we used to and wake up our parents and our grandparents, whoever else might be in the house. No, we're sophisticated now, and we are grown up, so we wake up at 7:30. We sleep in. It's a good time to be Thomas and I. And what will happen is Thomas and I will go into the living room and we'll take all the presents from under the tree, and maybe you all do something like this, and we'll put them all in piles and sort them so everyone has a pile in the living room: mom, dad, Thomas, Martin, grandparents, uncles, aunts, dogs, you name it. Everyone's got a pile. And then the most important part of the Leathers family Christmas morning is the Cinnabons. I mean, this is the centerpiece. The Leathers celebrate well, and we always celebrate with Cinnabons. And before any present is opened, before you find out what Santa brought you, the Cinnabons go in the oven and start cooking. That is first, always. And what happens, there's a reason for this, right? So when you put those in the oven first, you take them out, and the rest of Christmas morning, your whole house smells like cinnamon and sugar and calories. It is wonderful. It's the best kind of feeling. And once they come out of the oven, everyone grabs theirs and we all put it on our plates, and we eat it, and we go in the living room and find our pile, and we start opening presents one after another after another. And then we get to this weird moment, and maybe you all are like this, where there's no more presents, and the Cinnabons are unfortunately all gone. And you can't go get more Cinnabons because it's a special treat. We end up at the moment where presents have all been opened and all the wrapping paper has been crumbled and thrown into a pile, and we start asking ourselves, kind of like Ricky Bobby, like, what do I do with my hands now? There's a lull. What do you do? And that's like a little bit what this Sunday morning is like here, the Sunday after Easter. Easter, our big day, has come and gone, and we're left to ask, what now? Because it seems like for the next 6-7 months, we're just going to wait until Advent gets here and we get to have another big celebration. It's like the off season of church. But I'm actually convinced that Easter has so much more to do with today and tomorrow in our lives. So let's go back 2,000 years to a day this morning when these three women, Mary, and Salome, are going to the tomb at the end of Mark's gospel. And you have to realize they needed to anoint this body that had been hung. And they needed to go and get oils and spices to anoint it, because that was how you finished a burial in first century Israel. That was the closure of the ceremony. And they didn't have a chance to do this because they had to really hurry when Jesus came down. I mean, the other gospels tell us that the weather was getting a little bit hairy, and some strange things were happening around town. So they took Jesus' body down, and they threw it in the tomb, and they rolled that stone in front of it. But the women saw where they went, and they knew that it wasn't quite finished. Time was short, and they had to get there. But they couldn't just go the next day, because as Mark tells us, the next day was Sabbath. So they had to wait, and wait, and wait. And I got to imagine those hours just dragged, and one after another, knowing that they had something to do, but they couldn't do it. But then the morning the next day comes, and the way Mark tells the story, they left to buy their oils and spices the second the sun rose. But here's the thing. They didn't have back then these wonderful things that we have now. It's remarkable, actually. You can set an alarm, and it will wake you up whenever you want, and you can make any song ring you up. It's incredible. 2016 is a good time to be alive. They didn't have that back then. They had roosters and the sun. So a bit more primitive time in the world. So I'm imagining that if they were ready to go the second the first ray of light hit the horizon from the sunrise, that they'd probably been awake the entire night, just jittery, waiting to go. And you got to remember, they didn't have Red Bull back then. They didn't have coffee. I'm not going to ask anyone who raised their hand who had 5 cups of coffee this morning, but I know it's more than one. They were just going on pure adrenaline and like delirium. They were psyched because they had a job to do. So they set off running, and they went and picked up their spices and their oils, and they ran as fast as they could go to the tomb. They ran so fast that halfway to the tomb, one of them realized, hey guys, how are we going to move this stone? It's big, large. It didn't matter. Or maybe they did realize that, they just didn't care. They had a job to do. So they ran, and they just ran faster and faster, and then they stopped. They'd arrived, and I got to imagine everything got really quiet because the stone was already rolled away. And they got to start asking themselves, what the heck happened? Where did Jesus go? Who was here? What did they do? What is wrong? I mean, this is not how this is supposed to be. Maybe they were angry or in disbelief. So slowly, they start walking to the tomb, one step at a time. And then when they were just a few steps away, they noticed something, and something they could have never expected. It was a young man wrapped in bright white clothes, and he was sitting there on the bench where Jesus had been laid. But it wasn't Jesus. It couldn't be, because Jesus was dead. And they were scared, and maybe one of them stepped on a twig or gasped, but this man turned his head and looked at them. And I'm sure he saw in their eyes this fear or this anxiety, like, what the heck is going on? I mean, he could sense it. And so with a little small smile, he turned to them and looked them straight in the eyes and said, don't be afraid. I mean, like they were old friends, but they weren't old friends. And did nothing to help the women's fear. I'm sure they just started shivering with fear even more. Their lips got more sealed. They got more scared and more quiet. And so the man just kept on speaking. Yeah, so the man you came here to anoint, Jesus, yeah, he's gone. He's not here. And this is like stating the most obvious thing. It's like naming the elephant in the room. But someone had to say it. Jesus was missing. This didn't just happen. And so he just keeps on talking. He was raised, the man says. Raised. Now, this was officially not okay. Resurrection didn't just happen. This was not normal. The women, I can't imagine what was going through their heads, but there was the bench where Jesus was laid, and Jesus wasn't there. So the man in white didn't stop. He just kept going. Go, tell his disciples, and Peter too. He's going to Galilee where he said he'd meet you. Go, tell his disciples, and Peter too. And is a really funny word. It's like the most common word in our English language. It's this little 3-letter conjunction that we can put into basically every sentence and everything that we write. I mean, heck, so far this morning, I don't know if you've been counting, but I think I've said and 56 times. It just fits. It's small, it's cozy. You can put it anywhere you want in a sentence. It's just this small, insignificant word, and in fact, I think that "and" might actually be the most powerful and important word in the English language. So the Greek word that we have translated here, "and," that Mark wrote, is this little 3-letter conjunction, kai. Kai. It's no longer than "and," and people usually translate this word just "and." It connects two things. But the Greeks understood how powerful this little conjunction word was. And so while we translate it "and" most often, scholars throughout Greek literature translate it in like 15 different ways. I mean, it means a lot of things. And even in this one sentence in the Gospel of Mark, translators have translated it to mean different things. The Common English Bible says "especially." The New Living Translation says "including." The New English Translation uses "even," especially Peter, including Peter, even Peter. And you have to remember, the last time we saw Peter in Mark's gospel, he was busy denying Jesus in the courtyard while Jesus was being tried. And can you imagine how ashamed he must have felt? Can you imagine how disappointed and disheartened he was? Can you imagine how worthless he must have felt? I mean, he was isolated. He was separating himself from the group. He must have been so lonely and feeling so sorry for himself. And that's where the power of this Greek word kai is. Go, tell his disciples, kai Peter. And Peter, especially Peter, including Peter, even Peter. You see, when you add "and" to any list, it just means the list is going to get longer, that more people are included, that the RSVP list is going to get bigger to the party. Peter was the least likely character to be invited to whatever Jesus was about to be doing in the world. Who could have imagined that Peter's story was going to continue? I've got to imagine that Peter thought his own story was finished. He was done. He'd failed. But there was an "and" for Peter. There was a kai for him. You notice they don't say, "Go tell the disciples in Matthew. Go tell the disciples in Luke." I mean, when Matthew and Luke heard the disciples, they knew they were part of it. They didn't need any explanation. They didn't need a kai. They were in. They were part of the team. They were in the group. Peter was not. In fact, like this denying was just the capstone of Peter's failure in the Gospel of Mark. He's like the eager beaver who runs at any chance to impress Jesus and fails every single time. He doesn't do very much good in the Gospel of Mark. But denying Jesus, that was unforgivable. I mean, that was the final straw. Peter took himself out of the group. He didn't count himself worthy to be in their company. But the young man in the tomb needed Peter to know that there was an "and" for him. The young man in the tomb needed Peter to know that there was more to his story. There was a kai, that he was part of it. There was an "and" to his walking with Jesus. Because that's the other incredible power of "and." When you add "and" to a sentence, it means there's something that comes next, a next page, a next sentence, another chapter. There's more to come. It's suspenseful. It's like, what's coming next? What happens in just a second? I mean, there's this and that. This happened and that happened. The story's not over yet, and the story wasn't over for Peter, and it wasn't over for any of the disciples. And so what was it that the women were supposed to go tell the disciples? Go, tell them that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Why Galilee? Of all the places in the world, why would he go there? Why not to the temple? But Galilee was not insignificant to Mark. And they might know the specifics of what they were about to get into when they saw Jesus because, again, resurrection didn't happen every day. Like when they found Jesus, is he going to talk to them? Do zombies talk? I mean, if you heard someone raised from the dead, you'd say it's a zombie. Like, what does that look like? But Galilee was important to Mark because this is where everything started. If we go back to Mark 1, Mark doesn't talk about the baby in the manger. He doesn't talk about the shepherds and the wise men and the gold and the frankincense and the myrrh. That's not as important to Mark. What's important to Mark is where Jesus' ministry starts, when he's an adult at the baptism with John. And the very first thing that happens after that baptism, Mark writes that Jesus went to Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. And that's where he starts finding disciples, Andrew and James, just a couple of fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. And what else happens in Galilee? Jesus casts out demons. And he heals deaf people. I mean, these are the kind of things that happen when Jesus goes to Galilee. And so who knows what the disciples could expect to find when they got there. But if that's where Jesus was planning to meet them, you can bet that the story wasn't over. You could bet there was another chapter. You can bet that there was a he is risen and that and had something to do with the kind of things that Jesus did in Galilee. That might be a clue to what the disciples were getting themselves into. And so let's be honest, these women who have come with so much enthusiasm to anoint the body, to cover it in oils and spices, they run as fast as they can. They've heard enough. This is nonsense, and they are not going to listen to any more of it. They are so overwhelmed by this experience that Jesus might actually not be done. There might be an and to his story that Mark says they left with terror and amazement. They didn't tell anybody. That's how Mark's gospel ends. They just ran. So last week we did the amazement part. I mean, we celebrated. By the way, in the Justin building with the youth, we had like 500 balloons and some cookie cakes that said, "Welcome back, Jesus." And we had clappers and snappers and poppers. We were celebrating. I'm sorry you all didn't get to be part of it. And you are too, now that I mention it. I know. I can see it in your eyes. Remember, honesty this morning. No shoes. We're there. But that was the amazed part. That was what the women were feeling, but that wasn't it. There was an and with the amazement. There was terror. These women were petrified because the story wasn't done. There was more to do, and it's waiting in Galilee, and that is a terrifying proposition. I mean, it ought to be, because see, that invitation isn't just for the disciples. It's not just for Peter. It's not just for these 3 women who went to the tomb. It is our invitation. You see, if we're going to be the kind of people who celebrate on Easter, the story isn't over for us. Yesterday was not the end of the book. There is a risen Jesus running wild in the world, and he is waiting for us to meet him in Galilee. And this is where things start getting interesting for us. Because that means we're going back to the place where it all started for Jesus. I mean, that means that we're going to be asked to do the kinds of things and be the kind of people that Jesus did and was. And that may mean that we're going to be asked to feed the hungry. And that may mean that we're going to be asked to clothe the naked. It may mean that we're going to be asked to give extravagantly. It may mean that we're going to be the kind of people who are going to follow where Jesus is leading, not even knowing where we're going. I mean, the disciples didn't know where they were going when they signed up, but they just went. And it might mean we're going to be the kind of people who are supposed to speak life and hope into places where death just seems like it's winning. It will mean that your life won't ever be the same. It can't be. It will mean that your life will be transformed. And when that happens, this community, this space will be transformed. And when this church is transformed, our neighborhoods and our city and our state will be transformed because of what Jesus has waiting for us in Galilee. The disciples didn't know what to expect when they started following Jesus. And I'm sure at the end of the story with Jesus being crucified, it hadn't been anything like what they imagined. I mean, it wasn't safe. They didn't make lots of money. They weren't particularly popular people, and it certainly didn't mean they had a whole bunch of friends wherever they went. But that's what going back to Galilee meant for the disciples. It was a reminder that what happens next, the and now part of the story, wasn't going to be easy. No one promised it was going to be safe, but it was their turn to pick up where Jesus left off. It's our turn to pick up where Jesus started. And that's where we start. And like the disciples, I can't guarantee what we're going to find when we get there, and I can't promise what you're going to see when we arrive. I mean, that's part of the whimsy of it. That's part of the adventure, the excitement, the wonder, the terror. As we go to Galilee, I don't know what we're going to see, but that's what Easter is. It's terror and amazement. It's what has happened and what is going to happen. Because if we're going to be the kind of people who celebrate an empty tomb, then we have to be the kind of people whose work is just starting. We have to be willing to bring into places where death seems like it is constantly winning, where there is nothing but despair and hopelessness. We are the people who get to take life and hope into those places. And if you're out there thinking, this is not what I signed up for, I did not RSVP to this party, I do not belong here, I am not that guy, or I am not that girl, or I am definitely not the kind of person that Jesus was calling to meet him in Galilee, remember, Peter needed an extra invitation. He needed a special word. He needed someone to go out of their way to say, even Peter, especially Peter, had another chapter to write. Even Peter had more to his story with Jesus. And the good news is he probably didn't stop screwing up. He probably kept being a disappointment and fumbling over himself and doing the wrong thing. But can you imagine the power of somebody looking at Peter and saying, there's an and for you. There is a kai. There is more to come. You have not been kicked out of this group. I need you. That is speaking life into death, hope into despair. And here's the good news. You are not going to be alone in this. I mean, this whole place is filled with people who are getting invited into the messiness and the whimsy of whatever it is that Jesus is waiting for us to do in Galilee. And I promise you one thing, there's no one here on this holy ground that is perfect and has it all together. Jesus is not waiting for perfect people to get on board. He is not asking you to know exactly where you're going. Jesus is just asking us to take one step, one nudge towards Galilee, to see what might be waiting for us, to see what work might be left to do. If we're going to celebrate Easter as the empty tomb, we have to celebrate it as a journey back to Galilee. There's work for us to do, because this is where Easter begins. We've celebrated. I mean, we've opened the presents and eaten the Cinnabons, and it tastes good. But Jesus didn't stop at celebrating. Now it's time for us to go back and see what Jesus is up to. And I don't know what we'll find, and I don't know what our work is going to be, but I do know there's another chapter. I do know there's a next step. I do know that Jesus is running wild in this world, and I do know that there is a kai for each and every one of us. Let us pray. God, we thank you for being the kind of God who doesn't leave people out of the party, for being the kind of God who is constantly inviting us back to Galilee, reminding us that you have something in store for our lives, that we are part of a community of people who will pick us up when we mess up, but that you are constantly drawing us closer to you. So God, let us look in the world. Let us find the places where your presence has rested. Find the places where you are calling us back to Galilee, to the work that you have started. And God, give us the courage, the compassion, the hope, the grace, and the people around us to keep us going when we don't think we want to go, to find what you have waiting for us there. It's in your name we pray. Amen.